Shabbat Shalom. Last night, we read in the Megillah that a wicked man despised the Jews of Persia and cast lots to determine the date on which to exterminate them. He peel pur, we read in chapter 3, a pur was thrown down. Given the unusual word pur, the text clarifies itself. Hu hagoral, it says. That is, a lot. The text goes out of its way to clarify this, just in case we missed what was happening. And of course, this holiday of Purim takes its name from this moment of casting lots or throwing dice. We know what happens next. That wicked man convinces King Achashverosh to kill the Jews on the date upon which the pur landed, the 13th of Adar, until Queen Esther saves the day. And big twist here, folks, it's not the Jews who are massacred on that date, but nahafochu, the opposite happens. And the expected fate of the Jews becomes the fate of their enemies. It is, as I've said all week long, the ultimate revenge fantasy. And I hate to be the one to break it to you or to remind you that indeed it is just a fantasy. Never mind the lack of archaeological evidence to prove that it ever happened. The text makes it obvious that the book of Esther is not supposed to be a history, so much as a literary farce for its Jewish readers to let off a little steam. The idea that the Jews would ever be capable of sticking it to their oppressors in this manner is so preposterous that presumably even early readers of the text would have understood it to be a comic piece of fiction. That might be one reason why, famously, God doesn't appear anywhere in Megillat Esther. Perhaps the plot line was too silly and too undignified for the authors to throw God in there, even as a character, since they expected the audience to know it wasn't real. But even though centuries later, the rabbis argued that God acts covertly in the story of Esther, there is another mighty power that does make a splash in the Megillah: luck. Luck, or fortune, is represented best by the pur itself, the lot that was cast by Haman, but also appears in the luck of Queen Esther being in the right place at the right time and exactly the right sequence of events leading up to the role reversal of Jews and their enemies. In some ways, the whole book of Esther is a meditation on luck, which makes sense when we consider that the name Chag Purim essentially means the festival of dice throwing. On the face of things, this doesn't seem especially Jewish. We typically don't like leaving things up to chance. Our tradition gives us very clear rules for almost everything imaginable, so that we can prepare for any scenario and control as much as possible about our lives. And even if we say Mazel Tov all the time, the word mazal, meaning luck or fate, doesn't appear in the Torah at all. The Chumash doesn't ask or doesn't ever discuss luck or chance, offering instead a view of the world in which God has a clear plan for what will happen to the Israelites, whether or not they're willing to do what God wants. But maybe luck was always part of the bargain. In this week's Torah portion, Tetzaveh, we read about the garments of the ancient priests of Israel, which, like everything else, are precisely detailed according to God's command. Alongside a description of the tunic and headpiece and sash, we read something curious about what goes into the breastplate of the high priest. We read, "Inside the breastplate of judgment, you shall place the Urim and Tumim, so that they are over Aaron's heart when he comes before God." If you're not familiar with these items, the Urim and Tumim, they were essentially Purim, lots or dice, stones that the high priest would throw, and depending on how they landed, the priest would be able to ascertain the will of God. Especially if the priest needed to figure out which entity was guilty between two parties, he would throw these dice to get his answer. Important decisions where God did not give an instruction one way or the other were therefore exposed to the whims of chance. The Urim and Tumim were so essential to ancient Israelite religion that they were placed directly over the high priest's heart. Many scholars understand Urim to come from Arur, meaning curse. This makes sense insofar as when you throw the Urim and Tumim, you're basically betting on bad versus good, curse and blessing. In any dispute, you could throw the Urim and Tumim to determine who is guilty and who is innocent, depending on how the dice land, which would suggest that blessing and curse are, at their core, a matter of chance. On some level, we know that this is true. Who is blessed and who is cursed in real life usually has nothing to do with who is deserving of blessing or curse. It's not an easy thing for us to admit, and Judaism tries hard to say that the opposite is true. Deuteronomy says that God set before us blessing and curse, life and death, so that we could choose life and blessing by way of performing God's commandments. The Talmudic sages are also skeptical of luck. After debating the possibility of fate being sealed beyond our control, the argument ends with Rabbi Yochanan's assertion that Ein Mazal Yisrael, there is no fate for Israel. Like we say on the high holidays, each of us can always alter our lives, setting ourselves up for blessing by choosing to act in a better, more righteous, and more ethical way. But as we know, even that doesn't always yield the blessings we seek. Even if our tradition is set up to minimize risk and prepare us as much as possible, you could follow all of the mitzvot. You could be the most ethical, kind, and righteous person in the world, but you still might not be lucky. So Purim comes around each year to remind us of luck, to remind us that despite our impulse to control things, there are powers beyond us that dictate the good and the bad that we encounter. We hope for the best, and as the Megillah beckons us to remember, sometimes we can get lucky. But ultimately, there's plenty that we cannot change. Lest we think that if we do everything right, we'll be blessed, and if we don't, then we'll be punished, Purim disavows us of that notion. Sometimes, na'afochu, the opposite happens. We do our best, but blessing and curse aren't always in our power to control. Maybe that's what the rabbis had in mind when they articulated the famous behavior of this holiday. In their words, a person is obligated to become so drunk on Purim that they do not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. The inebriation is famous, but maybe the inebriation of this holiday is supposed to shake us out of the belief that we can control blessings and curses based on who's most deserving, and just try to let loose a little. Acknowledging that we aren't completely in control doesn't let us off the hook from trying. We need to live lives according to the mitzvot and the ethical principles of the Torah, and thereby create lives worthy of blessing. But instead of assuming that by doing all the right things, we're destined to be blessed, Purim calls us to relinquish control and leave some room for chance. Obviously, this is anxiety-provoking, leaving room for what we can't control. But to paraphrase the rabbis, all we can really do is party on and let the Purim fall where they may. Shabbat Shalom.